Hello, my name is Austin, and this is the third in a series of four videos covering the works of art I chose as a backdrop for my video on the Midnight's album by Taylor Swift. This video is going to cover the novel Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. Before I get started, I want to say this is not a review of the novel, as I do not believe I have the authority to review a work of art. This is nothing more than the way I interface with the novel at the age of 29 years, 3 months, and 10 days. Before I get started, I want to discuss two things that are unrelated to the overall concept of the video. One about the author and one about the novel. The When talking about David Foster Wallace, and I'm very intentionally referring to him by all three names right now, of all the artists I've applied any amount of hero worship to, David Foster Wallace would be the most extreme example. Before I read anything he had written, I had seen a video which included an audio recording of his This Is Water speech, and I built an image of him in my mind as one of the most empathetic people to ever walk the face of this planet. And I then read some of the stuff that he had written and sort of continued to build that concept. And I see now how problematic that was. Um, and this is why in these videos, when I talk about the artists outside of the very introduction, I tend to only refer to them by their first name because I need to remember that these artists are human beings, and like oddly enough, a lot of David's writings seem to echo that idea. The second thing I want to say is how whenever I used to introduce this novel as my favorite book, I would always make a comment along the lines of like, and this is your favorite book if you're trying to be the most pretentious person possible, especially since I have flags all throughout the pages or little post-it notes. And the thing that was concerning about this is that, right, I knew what the experience of me reading this book was, but somehow I was so concerned about the way people interpreted what I had to say that I would question my own intention and why I read this book. And I see now that's problematic. Anyways, jumping into this novel, I have a number of debts to it, and I don't, there's certainly no way I'm going to cover them all today, and maybe there will be more videos in the future. But today I'm only going to cover two debts that I have, and they sort of conceptualize the idea of the way I operate within something I'm going to refer to as a system. And a system can be many different things. It can be external, it could be like a government or an organization that you work for or anything like that. But more relevantly to both this video and this series of videos is the idea of internal systems. Um, and a major theme of this novel is addiction, and I would say consumption in general, but addiction, and throughout the um, throughout the text, it uses a lot of what like it describes as Boston AA verbiage or usage or anything like that, and a lot of times either alcoholism or addiction is referred to as a disease, um, and how people within the AA world, at least this novel's representation of the AA world, view alcoholism or addiction as a disease. And when I talk about systems and internal systems, I would say that having a disease and the impact that disease has on a person is a system that they're operating within. And so the first debt that I'm going to discuss with this novel is in relation to the idea of systems and the difference between causality and um, responsibility. And about a third of the way into the novel, there are a number of, I guess you could call them scenes from a Boston AA meeting in which people are sharing, as people do in these types of meetings, and they're telling stories, and there's sort of two stories in particular that I believe the novel itself highlights. Um, and I am going to read not the stories, but a lot of the words surrounding them. I'm going to skip the stories themselves, one, because it would take a pretty excessive amount of time to actually read them, but two, the actual topic of the stories is fairly challenging, and I don't want to include that here. But anyways, like I said, within a single Boston AA meeting, there are a number of people that share stories, but there are two in particular. The first one is from a uh, young woman who describes what she considers to be the series of events that led her to abusing substances. And as she finishes the story, another character is reflecting on what she said, and these words are that character's reflection on the woman's story. As she's telling what she sees as ideological truth, even though the monologue seems sincere and unaffected, and at least a B plus on the overall AA story lucidity scale, faces in the hall are averted and heads clutched and postures uneasily shifted in empathetic distress at the look what happened to poor me invitation implicit in the tale. The talk's tone of self-pity itself less offensive, even though plenty of these white flaggers, Gately knows, had personal childhoods that made this girl's look like a day at Six Flags over the Poconos. Then the subcurrent of explanation, an appeal to exterior cause that can slide, in the addictive mind, so insidiously into excuse that any causal attribution is in Boston AA feared, shunned, punished by empathic distress. The why of the disease is a labyrinth it is strongly suggested all AAs boycott, inhabited as the maze is by the twin minotaurs of why me and why not, aka self-pity and denial, two of the smiley-faced sergeant-at-arms, more fearsome aide-de-camp. The Boston AA in here that protects against a return to out there is not about explaining what caused your disease. It's about a goofily simple, practical recipe for how to remember you've got the disease day by day and how to treat the disease day by day, how to keep the seductive ghosts of a bliss long abscond from baiting you and hooking you and pulling you back out and eating your heart raw and, if you're lucky, eliminating your mat for good. So no whys or wherefores allowed. In other words, check your head at the door. And there are a few things I want to say about the passage. The first has to do with usage, and at the very beginning, David uses the word etiological, and I I really like this because, right, once again, if we're talking about the concepts of systems that I'm trying to operate within, and a disease is a system, then right, etiology is a pretty natural place to go, where I'm trying to figure out why is it that I ended up here. But then the passage continues to say the why of the disease is a labyrinth that has strongly suggested all AAs boycott. And the idea is within a disease as complicated as alcoholism or a system that is that complicated, um, asking yourself why this is the way it is, at least in my experience, only ends in a place of stating the system is terrible and blaming the system for all my issues. That is the only way to track down or that's the only result of trying to track down a why in this type of situation. Because if you try to tell why as a narrative of events in your life, then you're basically saying that every human being, if put in that situation, would behave that way, which is not, in my opinion, true. And once you start to open up personality as a cause, then that just unravels very quickly, and it's an unsolvable problem. And once again, in my experience, I just end up blaming the system uh, that I'm operating within. And as the passage reads, I end up in a place of either why me or why not, which it also refers to as self pity and denial. Um, right, and so that passage means a lot to me when it comes to how I approach something like a disease or a system that I could consider similar to a disease. As the AA meeting continues, um, another woman shares a story that is, even though I know it's fiction, it's hard to read. But the beginning or the story is prefaced with the following. It's not like Boston AA recoils from the idea of responsibility, though. Cause, no. Responsibility, yes. It seems like it all depends on which way the arrow of presumed responsibility points. The hard-faced adopted stripper had presented herself as the object of an outside cause. Now the arrow comes back around as tonight's meeting's last and maybe best advanced basic speaker, another newcomer, a round pink girl with no eyelashes at all and a bass head's ruined teeth, gets up there and speaks in an R-less South Boston brogue about being pregnant at 20 and smoking 8 balls of freebase cocaine like a fiend all through her pregnancy, even though she knew it was bad for the baby and wanted desperately to quit. The story the woman tells, um, once again, is very hard to read, and uh, it sort of concludes at the following. And how, when she finally got discharged from Met State with her first SSI mental disability check, she found she had no taste for chunks or powders. She wanted only tall, smooth bottles whose labels spoke of proof. And she drank and believed in her heart she would never stop or swallow the truth. But finally she got to where she had to, she says, swallow it. the responsible truth, how she quickly drank her way to the old two-option welfare hotel, window ledge, and made a blubbering 0200-hour phone call. And then so here she is, apologizing for going on so long, trying to tell a truth she hopes someday to swallow inside, so she can just try and live. When she concludes by asking them to pray for her, it almost doesn't sound corny. Gately tries not to think. Here is no cause or excuse. It is simply what happened. This final speaker is truly new, ready. All defenses have been burned away. Smooth-skinned and steadily pinker at the podium. Her eyes squeezed tight. She looks like she's the one. That's the infant. And this idea of responsibility instead of causality is something, like I said, that I sort of have a debt to because, right, I have throughout many moments in my life um, blamed the systems that I'm trying to operate within. And if I right, this woman, I don't think she denies the problems of the system she's in. She doesn't deny the problems of the disease, and I'm speaking to the intent of a fictional character right now. But that's what it sounds like. What I do hear in her story is that she's gotten to a point of simply accepting the system for what it is and asking herself, what can I do to operate within this disease in the healthiest way possible? And that's the debt, which is no matter what I'm up against, I can still try to make the healthiest decisions possible and try to work with the parts I can work with. The second idea I have from this novel that I want to discuss today has to do with the book as a whole. Um, a criticism that I'm not claiming is invalid, um, but a criticism I've heard from numerous people of this novel is that it it seems to be a display of intelligence, right? I mean, not only is it incredibly long, it has uh, complicated vocabulary and sentence structure and things like that. It also includes levels of knowledge that are seemingly not valuable to the story, right? It discusses things like optics or political theory or philosophy, but like it even gets to the point where it spends about 3 pages discussing uh, a theorem from calculus. And I've heard multiple people, especially once it gets to the calculus part, just describe this as either something like showing off or being self-indulgent or something like that. And I'm not saying these people are wrong. That is the way they approach the art. I do personally hear something different, though. I consider the entire novel David saying, I am really fucking smart. And I know this, and people have told me this my whole life. And I know that I have a pretty incredible level of intelligence. And this is something that I've heard has been really good my whole life. Once again, that's just what I hear. But when you're detoxing on the floor of a jail cell, it really doesn't matter how smart you are, or when you're lying in a bed in a psych hospital and you have to have somebody sitting right next to you around the clock because you've given people reason to believe you're not safe to be left alone for even 15 minutes, it it really doesn't matter how smart you are. Um, and right, I really hear this because I've in my life been told that I'm very intelligent, pretty much my entire life, and that I'm smart and I can do a lot of things. Um, but I've ended up in some pretty fucked up situations, um, where I promise you I really didn't care how smart I was. Um, and right, that's sort of the next idea from the book is that right we can have ideas of what success looks like, um, and a conceptualization of a system, in this case often like an external one, where right my vision of success growing up was doing really well in school so I could go to a nice college where I would then continue to do very well, in which I would get a nice job that was financially rewarding, that I would then work really hard at to continue to get raises and promotions and all of that. And I have executed that plan to perfection, right? And I it doesn't really matter though because I am not a happy person, and mentally I am not a healthy person. And at some point, and right, this is sort of the second debt that I have to this novel is that there has to be a point where you evaluate what success within a system really is, and if your ideas of success have actually worked out for you. I at this moment would like to give a quick shout out to the Stefan Marbury documentary that's on Netflix. And I don't know, I heard a lot of what Stefan had to say in that movie, and it meant a lot to me, especially the final scene where he's talking with the kid in the barber shop. But that's probably a video for another day. Anyways, uh, the song I've been listening to while recording this video is Here, one of the versions by Tindersticks. They have a couple of versions, and Pavement was the original artist on the song. I want to highlight one lyric from that song, which is I was dressed for success, but success it never comes.